it's not a good fit. It does, yeah. It needs to be useless. It needs to be over the top. It needs to be something that is totally ridiculous and very nerdy. So let's have the first contestant here, which is Dan Vreeman.
All right. So thanks everyone for joining. I am going to tell you today about the toasty tortoises. So I'm going to welcome you to the Vreeman Zoo. So in my family, we're all animal lovers. We have some animals that stop by the zoo that have permanent residence. We have other animals that are more transient in nature. They stay outside. And actually, we've had to put a cap on the length of time that they're allowed to stay at the Vreeman Zoo at 2 weeks because we don't have enough zookeepers to actively keep them up to date. But inside the Vreeman Zoo with permanent inhabitants, we have our dog Magnolia, we have Buddy the parakeet, a collection of freshwater fish, Dorito the painted turtle, and the stars of today's presentation, Burrito and Optimus Prime, the Russian tortoises. So Russian tortoises, as I'm sure you all know, are pretty chill pets. Actually, they don't require a whole lot of maintenance. They have a lifespan of about 40 to 60 years, which is not as much as the Galapagos tortoise, which you may be aware of, but long enough that there's a good chance they will outlive me. They get to about 5 to 10 inches. Their diet is pretty simple, leafy greens, but there are two key things that these kind of tortoises need. The first is they need adequate heat. They like it nice and toasty, pretty warm. So between 65 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and they need UVB light in order to have optimal shell health. So a normal tortoise habitat looks something like this: basic, enclosure, substrate, and there's a UVB light that you flick on in the morning, and as you go to bed, you might turn that light off. Typically, there would be a ceramic heater, which stays on all the time, so they have a nice place to warm up. What I'm going to tell you about is a true nerd tortoise habitat. So, like any good DIY project, you have to start with IKEA furniture. That's heavily modified, okay? So we're starting with the IKEA Detolf glass cabinets, side to side, put together with a tortoise tunnel in the middle. The bottom is reinforced a pine to be able to hold that heavy weight of substrate. And you might notice there in the back, there's some insulation to help keep the heat inside. But like any true nerd project, that insulation makes extensive use as binder clips as the mechanism for holding the insulation on. Okay, our tortoises, of course, need 24-hour supervision and surveillance in a live stream. So up in the corner, we have mounted an IP camera that must have a good night vision so that even when the room is pitch dark, you're still able to see what's going on. So this live stream is available at torts.danielvreeman.net and is made possible by an on-prem Linux server that has dynamic DNS and reverse proxying back to that IP server so that I can watch it even while I'm here at DevDays anytime that I want. Because it actually is inside my house, I've kept it password protected. But yes, it is. I can pull it up if you're doubting. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I mentioned that key need of UV light. So in our enclosure, we have 2 light setups, but to facilitate adequate circadian rhythm, these lights need to be auto on at sunrise and auto off at sunrise as well. And so in order to make that happen, we have the lights connected to smart switches, which are integrated with IFTTT, the API, if this, then that, in order to have the seasonal daylight change as we move throughout the year, so that in the summertime, they have an extended period of daylight, and in the wintertime, a shorter period of daylight. Now, temperature control is a little bit more complicated, but also more fun. So our tortoises in the daylight like it pretty hot, nice and toasty. So 75 degrees Fahrenheit or more in the daytime. And if it gets below 65, they will actually try to go into hibernation, which is possible. But given that we don't typically keep our house at 65 degrees, we don't want them to be thrown off by this trying to get into hibernation and so forth. So we want to make sure the temperature is above 65. So there are 4 independent heat sources, 2 heat mats affixed to the back of the cage, and 2 ceramic heat emitters from the top. So how do we actually keep that sort of running? Well, that's where some automation comes in. So each heat source connected to a smart switch. Those smart switches are controlled by some brains from a Raspberry Pi Zero that's kind of mounted underneath behind the scenes with a temper USB sensor using a long extension cord that's mounted actually inside the enclosure. Now on that Raspberry Pi, the Python script is running under a cron job every 15 minutes. What does it do? Well, it does a few key things. So that script calls out to the Open Weather Map API to grab the current outdoor temperature for my location. I'll tell you why that's important in a minute. A subprocess reads the current habitat temperature inside the enclosure and outputs then the habitat temp, the outdoor temp, and the current date time to a data file that's SFTP'd over to a self-hosted web server on my network. And then those two heat maps, which actually stay on all the time, are there. But then we have these other two sources that we can turn on depending on that inside temperature. So over on the web server, we have a nice dashboard rendering the data file, which is the indoor temp, the outdoor temp, and so forth. You can view that now at danielvreeman.net/temperature. And the nerd note about this setup is it's using a super cool plotly.js open source graphing library. Now, you might say that the dashboard is a little bit over the top, but it's helpful because this way I can more easily at a glance tell when in the summertime is that nighttime temp not dipping below 65, so they could actually go to the outside enclosure and not try to go into hibernation. And the last key feature of our habitat is, of course, power. Like any proper project, you've got to have battery backup. And so inside this little cabinet here, of course, we've got a UPS, which is running around the clock in case of a power outage. The whole system runs smoothly for that 5 to 10 minutes before the whole house generator can kick on. And so this is ensuring that everything stays up and running and our tortoises have the proper heat. So there you go, a true nerd setup for toasty tortoises.
Thank you, Dan. This is awesome. It had all the right components of a nerd presentation. It has the hardware, has the software, the Python scripts, the Raspberry Pi. Awesome. Who's next? Vadim, you want to go? 8 minutes. Very good, Dan. Awesome.
Where I don't, yeah, it's just this. The work. Yeah, the work. And I go to share screen, share my screen. Oh, nice.
Here you go.
Thank you. All right, that is going to be pretty hard to top, but I'm going to give it a go. So for as long as humans have been around, humans have been making games. For long as computers have been around, people have been making games on computers. The very first games that came around were text-based games because computers could only do text graphics. As soon as people started connecting computers, those computers together on the network, they started making text games with our players. Those games were first invented in the 80s, and lo and behold, they are still around. Woohoo! There we go. So this is an example of one of those text-based games. And the nerdy project that I've been building is I've been building this entire application to play these text games based with, right? There's many hundreds of these games available. If you look online, there's just lists of the various worlds that you can play in. You have various settings, sci-fi, fantasy, you have steampunk, pirate, Lord of the Rings, even themed games, all sorts of games that you can come and join and play. And these games are very international. So there's games I know in Italian language, in English, there's in French, there's even games in Spanish. There's actually quite a few which are even in Chinese. So thanks to this application, you can actually connect to these games using a protocol called Telnet, if you've heard about it. And you can play them. And just to give it an understanding of how it's like, let me actually pull it up a little bit so you can see the bottom of the line. So The bottom of the screen where you see a flashing cursor is where you type in your commands. So if I type in hi as a command and I press enter, you see my character in the game did something. It did a motion. It raised the hand and said hi, right? I can also type look, and I will look at the current room I'm in. And you see a very beautiful textual description of where I'm at. You can also see there's some exits. I can go southeast, south, or although there's a closed door, southwest and up. So if I go south, for example, and I'll just type S for short, I end up in another room. And I can actually interact with many other players who are playing this game. So if I do this, right now there's not too many people because in European time, there's not so many. And in North American time, it gets a little better. But there's many other people that I can actually interact with, have politics with, have fights with even. The whole combat system in this game is quite involved. So thanks to the client, you can play this game. Another feature of this client. Screen share is somehow paused. Yeah, screen share. New share. All right. Yeah. Right. Now, getting to the nerdy part of this, you can actually script this client to do custom things for you. So for example, if you think that typing in hello every time is too wordy, you can actually make an alias that just says, and this is where you put in regex. Oh, I'm on a Swedish keyboard, which I haven't quite learned. So typing regex is going to be complicated. But anyway, here's some example of aliases. Here's a regex pattern that you can enter. And this is some Lua code attached to it, which will get executed once you type this particular piece of text in. In the same way, you can also make triggers. So if you, for example, if you see some text like this, you see somebody talked in the market channel, and you want to take this market message and you want to do something with it, you can make a trigger, which will, again, use regex to match this text and run some custom Lua code for you to do an action for you. These things can get out of hand very quickly. You can actually spend days building your system instead of playing the game. That's one of the things I did back at high school and during university. I actually built whole combat systems, which would allow you to do combat inside this game, all made with Lua and a lot of regexes. And the combat systems are quite involved. The one I built, for example, it had an ability to dynamically determine which action it should do. I'll just give you a small code example here. So it actually came up with a thing similar to the entity component system, which is very popular in AAA game design before I knew what it was. So I kind of managed to come up with it on my own. So here's a particular action, and it's actually just a table in Lua, but you can think of it as an object. And it has an is advisable function, which when run returns true if this action should be done, and false otherwise. So it's a custom condition that happens. And also has all sorts of other functions available to do, for example, like when you want to start the action, this is what you need to send to the game. You need to apply a health potion to your legs. And so if you have the right affliction, and if it's in the right priority order, and you have the right salve balance, so you can actually do this action, and many other conditions, it'll execute it for you. You can see how it all got out of hand very quickly. Now these are just the triggers. Another useful property of Modlet, this is the application that I'm building, is you can also have custom interfaces in it. So people can make their own interfaces. So I'll show you one example for a game called Stickmud. You see, this one's quite different. This one has been customized. There's a health bar available here. There's a mana bar, there's an endurance bar. You can see which players are logged in here. And this is all custom, built for this particular game. They also have a way to track all of the information, to track your statuses. There's different buttons in the interface you can press. There's just one interface you can build. Another one that I can show. Again, another different game, another world that people have been working on. This one's again different. You see, you also have health bars, but you have customizable buttons on top. You have an effects. You can even pull up a world map if you want to, right inside of a client, right? So here's the map. And 1 minute. Well, one cool thing that I want to say is that besides being a huge time sink in my free time, is that a few people have actually reached out to me back again, and they said, thanks to playing around with these triggers, thanks to playing around with these aliases, this was their start in coding and in computer science. And some of the people have actually built careers after having been inspired and playing around and playing these games. So I think that's pretty cool. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vadim. I think that the spending much more time on building the system than playing the game will earn you points, but the last part was too useful. So I think the jury is going to have a hard time. And by the way, the jury, can you stand up, please? James, Ewout, and Josh. And they are not nerds. So our last contestant, Brian Caney.
Do I have to start the Zoom?
Yeah, you're online.
I don't know what I'm doing. No, I'm already in Zoom. Oh, I have to share though. Yes. What does this mean? Allow. I didn't start the Zoom, but don't. Oh, I can't let them see that. Oh. How do I do the Zoom share? Do the Zoom. You click share. Oh my goodness. You're doing great. Now is it sharing? Go there. More. Click on more. Click on more. Click on hide video panel. Good. Again. More. I don't want hide. That's about the meetings. You're doing great. Okay. Good. Okay. Hopefully this works. Hello. Okay. Hi, sharks. So, have you ever been to a fancy restaurant and you really like the food and you want to take pictures of it? Well, I had that experience today at lunch. And so I decided this is cool. I feel like I'm in a Michelin cafeteria. And I started taking pictures. And I took another picture. And I realized that this is pretty hard if I really want to get an action shot. And so I put together this idea. And I'm going to show you here. I actually made it physically. Yeah. Thank you. So I have my fork, which I eat with, and I made this device. It has a suction cup on one end. I can slip it over the fork quite easily. At some point, it would go all the way on like this. Now, what can I do with this? Well, obviously, put it on my phone, and I could take a selfie while I'm eating. So, for instance, imagine how cool this would be in my social media. Thank you very much. By the way, 2% for $500,000. This cost me about 18 cents to make. I can sell them for $9.99.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you, Brian. This was submitted to us as the secret project. I think you still had to make it up while traveling here. The jury will now deliberate about the winner. And when do we have the award? Is that's today, right? That's, yeah, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7. Oh, okay, 7 o'clock. This room, the Uber Nerd Award 2023. And there's food, by the way, here, so you don't have to leave. Dan, Vadim, Brian, thanks very much.